Okay. Good morning. I'm Dr. Donahue. I'm from Rutgers University. I'm an assistant professor of professional practice, and I run the certificate program there on children and adolescents. This presentation is more related to the work I've done previously. For 20 years, I worked in one of the largest school systems in New Jersey, so large it has 19 high schools, 65 elementary schools, and I worked across the district. Large population of students of color, about 60% African American, 40% Latinx, and about 10% white. During my time and in that work, right from the beginning, I had to respond to students or respond to schools after the homicide of a student. That did not happen in the school, so we're not talking about mass shootings, which is kind of what people are very focused on right now, but more the high rate of random shootings that happen among teens. And because we were such a large district, and because social workers are assumed to know how to respond to these things, I was often called to go to a school and just make it better. So it's been a real interest of mine. What I'm speaking about today is not original research. I'm looking basically at literature review and case studies, which is what we use a lot in social work. And my goal is eventually that to get some funding to do some research on this, because nobody else is doing it. For many reasons. I usually begin when I'm doing I teach master's level students, and I usually begin by asking them at the beginning of the semester, in any of the classes I teach, have they ever had any training in how to respond to traumatized students after homicide? Have they received trainings in their college courses or in their jobs? And almost invariably, nobody has. So in our graduate programs, even though in social work, we are not preparing students for these events, and they happen a lot. Last week I teach a clinical social work class, and I did some work around this with the students, and a student came back the following week. I asked, how are things going in the field? And she said, we had a student die this week on his way to school in East Orange, and randomly shot in the street. And again, the social workers were called in to respond to this. So in terms of my interest in this is my background also. We're kind of looking at youth homicide and current school responses, mental health responses we should use in the aftermath of a homicide of a student. And why I'm particularly focused on this is that we do have a real focus on the mass shooting, and there's some protocol around that. We are not, I would argue, very interested in this topic because it seems so out there. It seems something that we kind of don't touch. And I always have to give people trigger warnings, because some of the cases I'm going to talk about are shocking, and they have a traumatizing effect on the community in which they occur. It's also very difficult to hear. So in terms of the 10 leading causes of death, and even finding this information was, not that easy. So in the age group of say 15 to 24, homicide is the second leading cause of death in the US of young people in that age group. Suicide is the third, and sometimes it interchanges. There'll be years where the suicide is the second leading cause. Unintentional injuries, things like car crashes and other things. It could also be suicide. But so we're looking at it's normally overrepresented among males, usually firearm related, and largely it's also overrepresented among the Black and Latinx community. So looking at certain studies, the percentage of urban youth witnessing a shooting in their life ranges from between 4% to 70%, a humongous range, right? So the average we think is around 20%. And in one study of 1,548 6th to 8th grade students, 41% had witnessed a student shooting, stabbing, beating, 18% witnessed murder, 53% experienced the murder of somebody else. One of the reasons it's so hard to research this is we don't know exactly which students experience disproportionate rates of youth homicides, since they are not required to keep records. So in the district that where I worked, and I can give you some case examples, we never had an acknowledgement on the district website that we lost one of our students or two students, or and no concerted response about what we were to do with this. Very haphazard. And I think that's pretty much across the range of schools in the nation. There is an idea of kind of disenfranchised grief, because we sometimes, these deaths are dismissed as the gang related. Oh, it's gangs, and this is my experience, and the research would back that up, is that it's not. Gang involvement is a very not a very strict kind of, it could be that the student is in a gang based on the block where he lives. It's a very loose kind of affiliation. And sometimes our students will get killed because they're standing beside somebody who has a gang affiliation. That happened in one of my students on my caseload. And the student who was apprehended for this said to the cops, well, I don't know why you're arresting me. I wasn't aiming at him. That was an accident. I was aiming at somebody else. And then this very teenage kind of way of looking at this. And we do, as in a society, our appraisal of gang-related death affects the coping processes and responses, especially in the schools, because there isn't support for the notion that this is a valuable young person life and that it means something, and it's traumatizing for everybody involved. Trauma being the episodic or environmental violence. And I'm very interested in the notion that this ongoing trauma can trigger responses in children that lead to things like in New Jersey, for example, has the highest rate of classification of students in special education, highest rate of students classified as emotionally disturbed. And it's also usually young males. And I think that we're not looking enough at what the effect of having this hypervigilant response. And so you're in a school, somebody passes you in the hallway, bumps you, and now you think that you have to respond in a very aggressive or violent way. So it's trauma resulting from an event or series of events. There's individual trauma, there's collective trauma, whole communities. I have graphics here of real graphics of people in the street who set up memorials. You will see this in the city where I worked, memorials set up commemorating the person who was killed. And it's kind of a community collective way of dealing with this. But it's also a constant reminder. The meaning of this event can be overwhelming. I'm running through this because we only have 15 minutes for such a. So these are the long-term effects: free-floating anxiety, hypervigilance, underlying anger, resentment. In terms of our current school responses, we tend to have. First of all, we've started doing these mass casualty simulations. I did not know this until my students in my college started telling me that they had been doing them in high school, where they'll have even helicopters coming in and students putting bandages around each other and all that. Again, it's related to the mass shooting. Critical incident stress debriefing was in vogue for a while until 9/11, when we realized it had a opposite effect to what we wanted. There's individual and group counseling, and in some regions there is traumatic loss coalitions, which you can call on to come into your school. They generally are very focused on suicide. Again, there's a very different reaction in a community after a child has been killed by homicide versus a suicide, because of the disenfranchisement issue. I just met, I'm not going to play, this is a very interesting video by, let me make sure I get his name right, Shaka Senghor, who's an activist and a young man who was in prison for killing another young person when he was a teenager. And he talks about the fact that before he had done this act, he had himself been shot. He had been brought to the hospital and he was patched up. They took the bullets out, they patched him up and they sent him home. And not once did anyone refer him to a social worker, refer him to a trauma counselor. And his response to that trauma was to come and feel like, I better make sure that I'm protected. And so he ended up shooting somebody else. And he doesn't excuse himself for that. He said it was a terrible act he did. It's taken him a long time to get through that. But again, he mentions the fact that we're very focused on providing services in certain communities, but not in others, because we assume that this is the norm, and it's not. So in terms of my experience of how in my first month in the school, the district I worked at, we had a body, it was a young woman who was found at the back door of an elementary school by the custodian when he came in the morning, and they had to figure out what to do. It was an elementary pre-K through 5th class. And so they called on social workers in the district to come to the school and help the principal figure out what to do. And we were all placed in a room, and it was like mass chaos. So somebody decided we should have an announcement in the auditorium about this event. Those of us who knew a little bit about this work said you can't do that. You should never discuss this in a free-floating area without some structure. And this illustrated to me, again, the lack of training, the lack of a real response to this, a lack of taking this issue very seriously. And on and on as the years went on. We had a case where 3 young people were killed, 3 in different schools, 2 in a high school, 1 in an elementary. And again, we were called on to respond without, there's no protocol. In looking at the research, few articles on how schools should deal with this. There are developmental issues, and you have to target your response based on how the young person perceives death. It is a crisis intervention response. It's time limited. It's focused on the problems of living, orientated to the here and now. And I look at the difference between psychotherapy and crisis counseling, which is very different. So in terms of our training, we have to look at things like, who do we assist? For example, we had 4 young people who were college students who were home for the summer, and they were in a playground at the school of which they had graduated as elementary students. It was like a nostalgic thing. They were in the playground at night, and some other young people came in, and they killed 3 of them. And again, a very horrific kind of act. The siblings of the victims and the siblings of the perpetrators were both in the same school. So when you go into that school, you have to do triage. You have to figure out who are you going to put in groups for counseling. You can't just mix, as happened to me. I've gone to schools where they said, that's the room there, that's where that kid was, go in and do your thing, like we're magicians. So you have to look at a very specific protocol and who you assist, support, control, and structure. In one of the previous presentations, there was the idea that students perceive teachers as competent based not on their competency always, but on their perception of competency and how much the teacher is caring. That is true in these kind of situations also. From what we know of the research, the students need more to feel that there is support, control, and structure. And it is a very complicated grief. Very different from other, because it's sudden, it's violent, it's multiple, it's unspeakable, and the status of the victim often is is not acknowledged, that they are a young person, that they are somebody from the community that needs to be acknowledged, and that the community itself needs to be supported. So the perception of support is more important than the actual received. Support leadership is an effective mitigating factor, meaning we have to train principals, not just the social workers. The grieving students need information about the death. A lot of misinformation. The press is not great on reporting these things. They will call the victim by certain names. And permission to grieve, a place to grieve. I've often gone into schools where there was no place except hallways to talk to other students who were very upset. Even things like resources. I had the case where the 3 students were shot. The students came in the morning after, and they tend to stay up all night and they'll talk to each other on social media. They came into the school and they hadn't eaten all day. So I said, we need to give them food. We need to start with that. Let's start with, do we have any tissues? No tissues, no food. The cafeteria said, well, it's not time. I said, I think it's time, whatever, let's do away with the normal. And you need information about resources, and that includes what the parents will need, what the faculty and staff need, which is very, again, a very, there's a lot of re-traumatizing secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. We talk about secondary trauma in social work in terms of all of the tragic things we hear about and experience can be cause compassion fatigue and re-traumatizing in the person who's listened to them. Okay, and we also talk about what you do in these groups where you process. There is actually some positives from crisis. You may actually promote growth. There's certain things that people hold on to. We tend to see in crisis intervention that you have to do something. Just sitting around talking isn't always that it's helpful, but you need to really give them activities to do, and that will vary depending on. And people do have an enormous capacity to heal, and we need to overcome the stigma that surrounds mental health and trust the resiliency of the human spirit. So that's me done. Thank you.